Well, good afternoon, one and all. Range of people in the room. Good to see you all to the first of our seminar series here in the Institute of Sport, Physical Education and Health Science. You will, of course, recognise that the session is being filmed, so we also welcome our colleagues eventually from the University of Toronto in Canada, who will be joining us online later on. So it's welcome to the University of Edinburgh, welcome to the Institute of Sport, Physical Education and Health Science, welcome to the School of Education, and welcome to colleagues and students from Canada and the University of Toronto who will be joining us eventually. Our speaker today, to many of you, will really need no introduction because of the fields in which you have worked in over the past couple of years. But I'm just going to introduce Franceska Osowska very, very briefly. Well known for many things, but probably in the fields that we're working in. Most recently, she's been in charge of the Commonwealth Games, in charge of sport, in charge of physical activity for the Scottish Government. But as a civil servant in the Scottish Government, she's had a wide-ranging remit over the years, which has also included work in terms of housing, regeneration, education, social justice. And by training, Franceska is a civil servant, but an economist by training with degrees from Cambridge and the College of Europe in Bruges. And prior to taking up the Commonwealth Games portfolio, she was, of course, Principal Private Secretary to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. So we're delighted that Franceska is here to join us, because I can't think of anyone more informed in terms of how sport and physical activity in the Commonwealth Games in Scotland actually works, from inception through to delivery, through to that much used word legacy. But here's somebody who's been leading it, living it, delivering it very successfully for Scotland.
Thanks very much, Grant, and thanks for that introduction. And I hope you like the photos. So they're there to kind of give you something to focus on if kind of my voice is getting a bit too much. As Grant said, I'm going to talk about the role of a senior civil servant delivering sport physical activity in the Commonwealth Games. And I thought I would do this by just saying a little bit about myself and my career path, focus on a couple of roles that I've done as a civil servant. As Grant mentioned, latterly I am Director for the Commonwealth Games and Sport, so we'll obviously say a bit about that. And the only present, I'm afraid, I've got for you are some copies of the Glasgow 2014 highlights report, so which includes all facts and figures about the Games, and you're very welcome to a copy of that. But I'll also talk a bit about my time as Principal Private Secretary to the First Minister. Nice kind of informal group here. If I'm not making sense, Jen, please interrupt me. And obviously there's times at the end for questions. At the end, I'll also just give a few reflections on the skills that I think a civil servant needs, and how perhaps they've changed over the period of being a civil servant. I didn't necessarily want to be a civil servant, and I don't know that many people in the civil service who, age 13, what do you want to be? Little Johnny, I'd like to be a civil servant. I wanted to be an economist. I don't often admit it now because it seems so long ago, but I studied economics. I really enjoyed studying economics, and if I'd actually got better grades at university, then what I would have liked to have done is been an academic. However, I didn't. So I made 2 job applications. I applied to be an economist within the FAST stream of the civil service. The FAST stream is a graduate entrant program, and they run a scheme for economists. and for kind of other professions and generalists as well. And I also applied to be an economist at the Bank of England. And on one day, can't remember kind of when exactly, one day I got 2 letters. I got a rejection from the Bank of England and I got an acceptance from the civil servant service. So that was kind of the career path set. And at that point in time, I thought, well, I'll do this for a few years, but I won't become an institutionalized civil servant, and I'll be able to kind of move on to something else. And I took up my kind of first role as a civil servant in 1993. So I think it is fair to say I have become institutionalized. I started as an assistant economist at what was the employment department in Sheffield. It was a really interesting job. It was quite academic in its focus. I did analysis of rates of return to qualifications and skills. I never saw a minister. I didn't actually even know that ministers really existed. It was very hierarchical. Kind of my boss sat in an office kind of along the corridor. My boss's boss sat in a kind of bigger office kind of further away down the corridor. And I very rarely saw him. And, seeing him was a big deal and required preparation. But it was a great job. Sheffield, great place to live. But the chances of career progression there were pretty limited because everybody loved being in Sheffield. Nobody left. So I did a couple of other things. I went on secondment to London. I went on secondment to Brussels. And I then secured a post at the then Scottish office in 1997. I was still an economist then. I absolutely hated being an economist in the then Scottish office. It was a kind of miserable experience, not because of the Scottish office at the time, just the area where I worked, economist skills were not valued. And that is really not true of the Scottish government today, and probably wasn't true of a lot of areas in the Scottish office then, but it was true where I worked. So I took the decision to switch into what's known as the policy or generalist stream, and I took on a brief where I was responsible for early education and childcare, which I think is absolute proof of the generalist principle of the civil service, because I knew absolutely square root of nothing about early education and childcare policy. I don't have children. I kind of don't particularly interact with children, and certainly didn't at the time. Yet on my second day in the role, I found myself kind of heading in a hire car to Alloa to support the then First Minister, Donald Dewar, at an event about synthetic phonics. So that was a fantastic learning curve in terms of that switch. I did a number of different roles in education, including one where I had to move at a day's notice to deal with the aftermath of the 2000 exams crisis. You're too young to remember this, or some of you, sorry, I don't know why I look that way. And for those of you who kind of weren't around then, in 2000, the kind of Scottish examinations body basically messed up 17,000 kind of results of 12,000 students, which wasn't a kind of brilliant outcome in terms of running an exam system. So I kind of went and dealt with some of that. I was promoted into the senior civil service, and I mean, I'm not stressing kind of senior as a kind of a big up to my own importance, but just if you're interested in the structure of the civil service, and as you're at this talk, you might be, the difference between the senior civil service and the kind of non-senior civil service is that at the moment, the senior civil service is a kind of united structure across the UK with united terms and conditions and grading, whereas anything out with the senior civil service is for departments to kind of do whatever really they want. So that was still in education, and then I was then moved at 2 days' notice to a post in justice, which was similar, was not as good, shall we say. It was dealing with a proposal at the time. There was a Labour administration, a proposal to unify the prison service and criminal justice social work, and nobody really thought it was a good idea apart from one special advisor. So we're kind of pushing water uphill the whole time, falling out with everybody. And after a little bit of that, it was actually in a way quite fortuitous. I decided I wanted to take a career break and concentrate on triathlon training, which is something I do in my spare time, and not actually liking the job at the time was a great impetus to do that. And when I came back after my year's career break, I took on the role as head of sport. This was 2005, and it was at this point that the Scottish Government announced its intention to back the bid for the Commonwealth Games. And I worked on the bid for 2 years, and my last day in that role was the day in Sri Lanka where the president of the Commonwealth Games Federation said, and the 2014 Games are awarded to Glasgow. And at that point, I left that brief, and I was there with the First Minister, and I kind of seamlessly moved in to being the principal private secretary for the First Minister, which I did for 2 years, lived to tell the tale, and then after that kind of had a succession of director roles. The first was the brief of culture, tourism, and external affairs, and was known as the kind of director of fun, because I mean those are quite fun things, and certainly my partner, who has provided these photos, thought that was great because we got some really nice invites to things. I then kind of had a slightly more sobering role as director for housing regeneration, the Commonwealth Games and Sport, and that's when the Commonwealth Games and Sport came back into my portfolio. And from the beginning of 2013, as the Commonwealth Games became ever closer, the role kind of focused solely on the Commonwealth Games and sport. And it obviously won't have escaped your attention that the Commonwealth Games has finished. I'm still calling myself the director for the Commonwealth Games and Sport, but at some point in the future, probably after we're clear on a new Scottish cabinet, once the new First Minister is in post, I will probably change to a new role. So that's just a bit of the context and the history, and I wanted to just set that out to give you a sense of the different roles that people can have within government. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Principal Private Secretary to the First Minister, which was a very kind of interesting, hard, enjoyable time. And I just wondered if anybody would like to kind of venture some thoughts on what they think the role of a Principal Private Secretary is. Does anybody remember Yes Minister? Yeah. So there's a brilliant, and if those of you who are not familiar with Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, I apologise. Fantastic British sitcom. And when one of the very early episodes, when kind of, poor, kind of hapless MP becomes a minister, and one of his civil service advisors takes him through all the kind of different roles, and the assistant secretary does this, and your kind of private secretary does this, and your permanent secretary does this, and they're all secretaries. And then the, poor minister says, so can they all type? And so Humphrey goes, no, they can't all type. Your typist does that. And it is a very anachronistic title. Sorry, I think you were going to kind of say something on the role of a Principal Private Secretary. Unfortunately, or kind of actually fortunately in my case, I didn't have to write speeches. I had to read speeches. And I suppose actually that's quite a good example of the role, in that it was a role that faced two directions. It faced to the First Minister, and it faced to the rest of the organisation. And the role was really to be that interface between kind of a very senior politician who, let's not forget, when kind of ministers become ministers, they haven't had training for this. They haven't been on a course which says, and this is what it's going to be like. So they're plunged into this. They don't understand civil service bureaucracy. They don't understand the organogram. They don't know their kind of assistant secretary from their permanent secretary from the private secretary. And so you're the kind of interpreter for this. You're the kind of translator for a lot of that. And similarly, you're the translator back to the First Minister. And when I became Principal Private Secretary for the First Minister, he'd been in office for about 6 months. So I was kind of his first new, he'd inherited the principal private secretary from the previous First Minister, Jack McConnell. So I was his first new one. I wasn't sent on a course either. So I had no idea what a principal private secretary was meant to do. I was told to go to Sri Lanka and get on with it. And actually, in some ways, that was great because we actually found our own way in doing that. But the kind of, the translation point between what the organisation needed and what he needed was a very key role in that transmission of messages. And sometimes your politicians are going to be in a very different place to your organisation. So, the First Minister's preoccupations for that day might be a press line running, in the Press and Journal in Aberdeenshire, given that's where he's from. The organisation's priorities for that day might be how we kind of square a particular policy position. And somehow my role was to get in between those two competing priorities and say, yeah, First Minister, I understand, that the kind of, Banff and Buchan Gazette is really important to you, but actually this is quite important too. So there was an issue about communication, being sensitive to the moment, being sensitive to the rest of the organisation, because, I don't know how far the First Minister's reputation precedes him, but he's quite blunt in some of his views, and I had to translate some of that to the organisation. And so phoning, somebody up who had probably put a lot of work into something and saying, actually, the First Minister wasn't really kind of happy with this, is quite difficult. And I would never use his words, but you had to be able to convey that message and convey it sensitively, and including to other ministers. So a kind of very memorable occasion was the first banking crisis moved into a time of austerity. It was agreed at Cabinet that all ministers would take a pay freeze. Not all ministers were at Cabinet. So there I am phoning the Solicitor General, who I think I'd spoken to once, and said, oh, by the way, you weren't there, but the Cabinet's just agreed to freeze your pay. Is that okay? If he'd said no, I don't know what I would have done. So there was that kind of communication point, which was both to the rest of the organisation, to other ministers and the outside world. There was a big role in management of everything that is around the First Minister. So his correspondence in his office, we generally got about 500 emails a day, which could be classed as correspondence. So people, from kind of the outside world wanting an answer to something. We got a kind of huge volume of written letters, and all of that had to be managed. His diary was a kind of very movable feast. If he was doing events, then, who was bringing the present for the kind of, ambassador of Romania. So that whole management. Now, I didn't do all of that single-handedly. Nobody could do that. But the First Minister certainly looked to me to make sure that was organised for him. And I also managed all the other private offices for other ministers, and, who had their own kind of challenges and, strengths and weaknesses at the time. I think the role was very dependent on the First Minister of the day. Nicola Sturgeon will want something very different, I would expect, from her principal private secretary. What this First Minister didn't want was a policy advisor. If he wanted policy advice on energy, he would ask his energy officials. If he wanted an external expert on international sport, he would ask Grant. So I was the kind of gateway to those people, but I wasn't expected to be the policy advisor. And that can be quite different. Other First Ministers have used their principal private secretary much more in that kind of policy space. One thing that he did really want me to do was to influence the culture of the organisation. So this administration, the SNP administration, they've got a very particular way of governing. It's very interventionist compared to previous administrations, and they like to act and react to events and show that the government is on top of something and listening to people and then acting to make a difference. So one of the things that he always used to tease me about was he'd say, Franceska, I want you to arrange it so that when people switch on their computers every day, people being the civil service, that the first thing that flashes up is your role is to enable things to happen. Now, I never did that, and I won't bore you for the reasons why I never kind of, carried out that instruction, but I think that's an indication of what he wanted the organisation to be. He wanted it to be enabling, he wanted it to be kind of able to react to events. He didn't just want the kind of standard, party line of, oh, this particular issue, this is not for the Scottish government. It's for the UK government, it's for the council, it's for some other organisation. That was never good enough. Well, if it is for in the locus of somebody else, what are we doing as a government to influence that position? So it's all about enabling and facilitating. So what did I learn from that role? Well, the amount of political exposure you get in that role, compared, if I contrast to my first assistant economist job in Sheffield, where I didn't even know ministers existed. I mean, this was night and day. But actually, in terms of, running a country, it's very easy to sit in a kind of a semi-ivory tower within the civil service and think that everything is dictated by rational decisions. A lot of things are dictated by rational decisions, but there's also a lot of politics. Politics is about winning votes. Politics is about keeping a party together. Politics is about responding to events. So that kind of exposure and understanding that, I think, was really valuable to me. And the First Minister himself, he's not a great strategist, and that might surprise you because from the outside it looks as if there's always a great kind of strategic plan. He's a very tactical thinker, and he reacts tactically to events. And there are times when that's a fantastic thing to do, and that's a fantastic skill, and that kind of tactical and the benefits of that tactical decision making are needed. So that was great to see that. He had a unique leadership and management style, not all of which I have employed, but some of it I have. I mean, some of it, one of the things that he did, he was very consistent in his messaging. So if there was an issue running, and I would be with him for a particular day. If there's an issue running, I would see him being interviewed, by different news outlets, for example, or he would speak to different stakeholders, and he would basically say the same things, generally 3 things, to have 3 key points, and he would just consistently repeat that. And we got to the point in terms of when we were briefing him, we tried to make sure we had those 3 key points that could be played out, and that benefit and value of consistency I thought was really interesting. We had to learn to anticipate things with him. So with previous First Ministers, dear First Minister, we've got a problem with X. What would you like me to do? That was never going to work with this First Minister. So we had to kind of think that through. So dear First Minister, we've got the problem here, and we have done X, Y, and Z, and our next steps are going to be this. Where would you like to follow up, or where would you like us to do more? So that kind of benefit in terms of anticipation. Again, I think in terms of leadership and in terms of management, I've kind of drawn quite a lot from that. And the other thing that he used to kind of tease me about quite a lot is he would always say, use the weight of the office. And that was no reference to his own kind of physical stature. That was about, he was First Minister of Scotland. And therefore, he expected things to run in a certain way. And I wouldn't claim that I've kind of deployed that, 100% kind of in my current role. But there is something about taking authority from your position and knowing when to be able to use that authority and use it legitimately. So that was Principal Private Secretary to the First Minister. There's obviously quite a lot of stories behind that, which we can maybe get into later. So as kind of Director for the Commonwealth Games and Sport, I am the lead civil servant for the Commonwealth Games. I also sit on the Glasgow 2014 board, which is still kind of operational until the company winds up. And kind of, let's hear a bit more from you. Do we know how many nations and territories competed in the Commonwealth Games? 71, very good. Why isn't it? There are 53 countries of the Commonwealth, so why wasn't it 53? Testing your kind of knowledge of Commonwealth history. Yeah, he's not allowed to answer. Okay, so for Commonwealth Games purposes, the overseas territories and dependencies, compete as kind of individual nations. So, for example, for the UK, competed as 7 constituent parts: Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, Wales, Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man, and there are other overseas territories who compete separately from their kind of jurisdiction. There were 17 sports. Can we name them?
I'll start with swimming.
Yes, very good.
Badminton.
Yep.
Bowls.
Yep.
Judo.
Yep.
Hockey.
Yep.
Triathlon.
Yeah. Good.
Shooting.
Yep.
Athletics.
Yep.
Cycling.
Yep.
Netball.
Yep.
Boxing.
Yep.
Hockey.
Said hockey, but yep.
Table tennis.
Yep.
Are you
Badminton.
counting? Badminton won't be going in. How many have we got to?
You've got about, oh, somebody's keeping count, even better.
Weightlifting.
Yes.
Oh, squash.
Yep.
Double for that.
Rugby sevens.
3 left.
Wrestling.
Wrestling, yeah. Rugby, sevens, yeah. Mountain biking's part of the cycling programme.
1 left.
I think we got it all there. So
Diving.
diving's part of aquatics. So aquatics, athletics, badminton, boxing, cycling, gymnastics, hockey, judo, lawn bowls, netball, rugby sevens, shooting, squash, table tennis, triathlon, weight lifting and wrestling. This was the biggest sporting event that Scotland has ever seen, probably the biggest sporting event that I am likely to see in my lifetime in Scotland. It's one of the biggest multi-sport events on the planet. There were nearly 7,000 athletes and officials accommodated in the village. In fact, I think at one point over that 11-day period, there were probably more. 15,000 volunteers, 1.2 million tickets sold, 1.5 billion TV audience. This was a big deal. And it was a big deal for the Scottish government for a number of reasons, which I'll come on to. The budget for the Games in total was 575 million, which included a 90 million security budget. The security budget was met in full by the Scottish Government alone. The rest of the Games budget was comprised of about 111 million commercial income, so that's sponsorship, merchandise. So if you bought a Clyde, thank you very much, ticketing, and then the rest of the funding was provided by the 2 public funding partners, 80% the Scottish Government, 20% Glasgow City Council, and it kind of adds up, if you take the 90 million security, it adds up to about 450 million that the Scottish Government provided. The Games was delivered by a partnership, so the Scottish Government as kind of key funder and I would argue bearer of risk. Glasgow City Council, the kind of host city, most of the Games was in Glasgow, not all of it. Triathlon was in North Lanarkshire, in Strathclyde Country Park. The diving was here in Edinburgh, and shooting was at Barry Budden, which is in Angus. But Glasgow City Council hosted most of the Games. Commonwealth Games Scotland provided the kind of team input. They're responsible for the selection of Team Scotland. They also input in terms of athlete kind of views as the Games were being designed and delivered. And then Glasgow 2014 was the company that was set up when we won the bid to do the delivery of the Games. Now, that partnership structure led to a really interesting dynamic because every organisation could claim to be in charge. So the government could claim to be in charge, and we quite like to do that because we were putting in the bulk of the funding. The City Council could claim to be in charge because it was in their city, and their city was going to be a kind of showcase to the world. The Games are actually awarded to a Commonwealth Games Association. So the Commonwealth Games brand is passed on from the federation to the association. So Commonwealth Games Scotland, as holder of those rights and as kind of holder of the team, they also could legitimately argue that they were in charge. In Glasgow 2014, as the company delivering, they could. So that partnership, which worked really well, and in the kind of inspections that we had from the Commonwealth Games Federation, they always commented on the strength of the partnership. But it was an interesting dynamic, and there were kind of challenges within that partnership. And for the Scottish Government, I suppose there were a number of issues that were important. The money was important, so we needed to protect our investment. This was a huge amount of public funding going into what some could say was a very narrow 11-day sporting event. I wouldn't say that, and I'll come on to say why. But that investment needed to be protected. Also, if anything had gone wrong, then where would the risk lie? It would probably end up back with the Scottish Government. So there's something about kind of managing the risk and the reputation in terms of Scotland's ability to kind of host major events. And for the Scottish Government, we saw it kind of far beyond 11 days of sport. For government perspective, this was about using a major event as a public policy catalyst. And whether that kind of public policy was around physical activity levels, whether it was about regeneration, whether it was about improvement in Scottish businesses' ability to win contracts, whether it was about the kind of getting our cultural partners to engage, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these public policy perspectives were really important in terms of the Games and were a catalyst to future public policy and obviously a catalyst to the development of legacy. So in terms of what I did and my role, the Scottish Government, we weren't responsible for example, timing the 100 metres or getting the timing systems in place or getting the athletes from the village to Hampden. That was all Glasgow 2014. They did all that operational stuff. So you could say, well, okay, so you've stumped up the money. What is your role? Well, we had 4 kind of main aims. Obviously, to support the other partners in successful delivery, and support is a really important word there, and I think goes back to this sense of partnership. It was absolutely the Scottish Government's responsibility to deliver a safe and secure Games. So the security piece was absolutely within our remit. We wanted to use the Games as a way to improve sport in Scotland, both at elite level, so team participation and getting good results in terms of team participation was really important. The facilities that we use, which could be used to inspire future elite athletes and could be used for future Games, was very important, and obviously to improve the participation base for sport. And then the legacy programme overall, and there are kind of 4 legacy strands and over 50 legacy programmes. So, and using the Games as a kind of major catalyst to legacy and opportunity beyond the Games. So those were our aims. There were 40 objectives which underpinned those. I'm not going to go through all 40, you'll be delighted to know. And I think my role kind of breaks down into a number of issues and kind of key points. So I was, and still am, the lead official on the Games. So I was the lead advisor to Shona Robertson, Cabinet Secretary of the Commonwealth Games and Sport, on Games issues. And other ministers kind of had an interest in the Games as well. The First Minister chaired a kind of high-level governance group that we had called the Strategic Group, all partners represented on it. So if there were issues, and there were, then it was my job to kind of ensure that ministers were fully briefed and advised on those issues. It was also my role to make sure that the connections in terms of the Commonwealth Games were made across government. So 2014 was quite an interesting year for Scotland. I'm not going to say anything about the 18th of September, although I can talk about that later. But in terms of just major events, Commonwealth Games, Ryder Cup, Homecoming, and we needed to make sure that all of those things linked together and there was kind of synergy between them. I also sat on the Glasgow 2014 board, and that was quite an interesting dichotomy because the board, when we sort of signed the bit of paper to say we are directors of the company, we were signing a bit of paper which said, and we will act as kind of independent board members. So we will act in the interest of the company. Yet I was always very conscious that I had a minister behind me, I mean, not quite literally, and had to take into account the views or likely views of Scottish ministers without this necessarily being a representative position. I think I had a kind of very key role in holding the partnership together, and I think all the kind of principles, if you like, from the partners had that role. And often we were the kind of broker of last resort or first among the equal. I mean, depends how you want to express it. But there was something about the government's role and knowing when, an issue was going to be really important to government and important to ministers, and when we could step away. And actually that ability to be able to step away and compromise, I think, was a really important lesson through the games. I had a role, and I think this was coming back to the public policy perspectives, quite a strong role in actually talking to Glasgow 2014 and explaining to them that the Scottish Government did have public policy perspectives that we would really like the Games to respect. If you're sitting in an organising company and you've come from the last major Games that you delivered, then, the kind of landscape around you and the politicians around you don't necessarily mean a lot to you. You're concentrating on timing the 100 metres and getting the athletes in place. And I kind of, I'm caricaturing this a little bit. So when I waltz up and say, actually, the Scottish Government would really like this to be the first smoke-free Games that there's ever been, from an organising company, from Glasgow 2014's perspective, they were like, oh, God, you're having a laugh. Operationally, this is going to be really difficult for us to deliver. And there were a number, that's a true example. There were a number of others where we had to kind of negotiate through the kind of operational delivery perspective of Glasgow 2014 and our own public policy perspectives. As I mentioned, there were 40 objectives. If anybody's interested in programme and project management, then I'm delighted to talk to you afterwards about the way that we ran a programme board to deliver those 40 objectives, but we did, and I chaired that programme board. I was senior responsible owner in the lingo, and I also kind of led a team which grew from a very small team. There were about 5 people working on the bid. When it got to Games time, if you added in all the people from throughout the Scottish Government, we were at about kind of 200, and now that's just completely fallen off a cliff again. So there's a kind of quite a big leadership role in motivating people to come together, sometimes for quite a short period of time, to work to a fixed endpoint, and then to move on. And now, kind of after the Games, emphasis absolutely on legacy, the 4 themes of flourishing, which is about business and employment, active, kind of speaks for itself, connected, which is about culture and education and sustainability, environment and regeneration. And we need to ensure that we don't lose everything that we gained in the run-up to the Games. And the legacy programme started way before the Games. We consulted on it as soon as we won the bid. It was one of our 100 days commitments, so it's been a very long-standing programme, and it has a long-standing evaluation programme associated with it. We didn't do what London did, which was to set targets. We didn't say we're going to set a target of winning, £1.1 billion worth of international business. We said we will have a rigorous evaluation programme and we will measure, and we will keep measuring until 2019. And again, I'm delighted that Niamh is here, who can kind of answer any of the kind of detailed and difficult questions on evaluation of legacy. So what did I learn in that role? I think the importance of relationships. So you can have on paper a governance diagram, and we had the most horrendous governance diagram you've ever seen, and you can have all your theories about who should be doing what when, but actually if you don't have the relationships that underpin that and the trust, it's never going to work. The point about compromise I've made, but I think in terms of the leadership role, there were people within my team who, would come to me and say, I can't believe what, whichever partner it was, Glasgow City Council, Glasgow 2014, blah, blah, have done. I'm going to, and it would be my role there as a leader was to kind of try and get across a culture of being able to step back and let go when that was appropriate. I'd seen when I was Principal Private Secretary the need for absolute, clear and direct advice. I mean, there's no point mucking about when you're trying to tell ministers bad news. And we had some bad news, the kind of review of the security budget. I mean, it all worked out in the end, but kind of increasing a security budget from 43 million to 90 million is generally not going to play well. The Red Road Flats was perhaps not the finest hour in terms of communication, and we had to kind of be very direct with ministers in terms of what the options were. One thing that was great on this project is we had a fixed endpoint. The opening ceremony was going to be the 23rd of July, no matter what. And actually, in the civil service, it's very it's very interesting how things get moved. Oh, we're going to launch something in the autumn, and it's always a season, because seasons kind of can be as broad as you like. Going to do X in the autumn. Oh well, we're now going to do it in the winter. And that I personally find a bit frustrating, and I'm sure the outside world find that frustrating. This was great because there was none of that, and it meant that in terms of the team dynamics, in terms of the partnership dynamics, we all had that same focus. So that was the Commonwealth Games. I thought I would just conclude in terms of, so what do I take from that? What is a civil servant? And people ask me, they say, well, I know you're director of the Commonwealth Games and Sport, but what do you actually do? And my sort of stock answer to that is I send emails and go to meetings, because that's what every job is, isn't it? You send emails, you go to meetings. But I was kind of doing a little bit of research, because I thought, is there a definition of a civil servant? And actually there isn't. Wikipedia, it talks about the civil service, it doesn't talk about civil servants. And as we know, Wikipedia is the gospel in terms of any definitional issue. But the Civil Service Code says the civil service is an integral and key part of the governing of the United Kingdom. It supports the government of the day in developing and implementing its policies, and in turn delivering public services. Civil servants are accountable to ministers, who are in turn accountable to Parliament, and the core values of civil servants are integrity, honesty, objectivity and impartiality. So breaking that down, I mean, there are two things that are really important, I think, coming out of that. The supporting minister's role. Now, as I said, when my first job, that was absolutely invisible. To me, it's become much more visible recently. But, I think at essence, that's kind of in our core, is to support ministers implement the policies of the day, whatever those policies are. And you might not agree with them. You might not agree that there should be a single agency covering the prison service and criminal justice social work. You might not agree that we should be giving kind of free kind of early education and childcare to 3-year-olds, but it's your job to do it. And that kind of could lead us and might lead us into an interesting discussion about the role of the civil service in the referendum. The second part of that kind of definition was about delivering public services. And I think that's something that certainly the Scottish Government has focused on much more readily, certainly with this administration, but even before. So we have a real emphasis on what are the outcomes of what we're doing for the public. How are we making things better for the people of Scotland? We are the first government, I think, outside of one of the US states, which has an outcomes framework, a very transparent outcomes framework, 15 national outcomes, 45 indicators. You can go on it. It's called Scotland Performs. You can see how we're doing. And you can take a view on whether the Scottish Government is actually kind of improving outcomes for the people of Scotland. And, back to the First Minister and, our job is to enable things to happen. That was his point. We're here to try and make things better. And certainly with the emphasis in public service reform in the past few years, I think that has come much more to the fore in terms of the role of civil service. So what does that mean for the skill set? I think when I certainly joined the civil service, and certainly kind of the generation before me, there was a big emphasis on kind of academic knowledge. And, it has the tradition of attracting a certain type of cerebral academic. I think it is still true, although the kind of intake has broadened kind of massively, it is still true that analysis is a really key skill. The ability to look at a number of issues and draw a conclusion and be able to synthesize and look at, you know, a range of evidence and present, you know, an impartial picture. But I think what has changed now is that we've recognized that policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, we need to be alive to connections across government. We need to understand, you know, relationships. We need to understand what, you know, the business sector is doing, what the third sector is doing, what other kind of parts of civic society are doing. It doesn't happen just in a little bubble in St Andrew's House or Victoria Quay. I think we're probably also getting more involved in actual delivery. So the Commonwealth Games job that I did, I would say, is much more delivery focused than any job that I've ever done. It was about making something happen by a particular date. And that's not traditionally the kind of the skill set of, you know, thinking great thoughts around difficult problems. So getting things done has not always been, I would say, a traditional civil service skill set, but I think that's coming more and more. And you look at jobs, for example, in Transport Scotland, absolutely about getting things done. You know, that bridge has to be built by a particular date. I think the other change in emphasis is leadership. So there's a really kind of big drive across the civil service and certainly in the Scottish Government on leadership development, about how we empower people working in kind of our teams. Gone are the days when, you know, my boss's boss, you know, sat in a kind of room that I sort of maybe saw, you know, once a year, and kind of seeing him as the biggest event in my working week. Much kind of more flexible kind of hierarchy, much more kind of flexible ways of working and ways of communicating across the organisation, and a big drive on leaders improving capability and capacity in the organisation. And my final thought in terms of skills, and this isn't really a skill, I suppose it's an attitude, I think we're becoming much more pragmatic as individuals, because we're having to deal with, I think, you know, in the same way that every kind of profession is now dealing with information from 100 different sources at once. Things are moving much faster. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a cliche, but the world is a different place, and we need to be able to react to events much more quickly. So kind of having that kind of more pragmatic approach rather than this is how it will be, which I think characterized some of kind of the civil service in the past, is definitely true. So my conclusion, I think, is that I've done a range of great jobs. I've done some jobs I didn't particularly like, but, you know, it's been fantastic to have that range. Kind of my current role, I would say, has definitely been the highlight. This is the job I've enjoyed the most, and I've only really scratched the surface of that. I don't know what's going to come next. That'll be interesting, but a reflection is that actually I wonder whether as an organisation, the Scottish Government and the civil service overall needs to think about how they use people who've done effectively time-limited jobs and have harnessed those kind of maybe more focused delivery skills in their next role. And I think that is something which the organisation perhaps needs to adapt to.
Hi there.
Hi.
Amanda Martindale, lecturer in sport and performance psychology. Thank you for a very insightful talk. I was interested particularly in what you were saying about facilities and infrastructure, and also thinking about future participation and these types of things. I was working up at Barrybudden during the Commonwealth Games, providing sports science support up there to the shooters. I've got sort of two questions related to that. One is around the facilities. Obviously, up there, a temporary facility had been put into place, as in the rifle range. And I just wondered about how some of these decisions were made about fixed facilities, like, for example, the wonderful velodrome, versus facilities which were literally put up and then ripped down, in terms of what that says about future participation. And also about some of the decisions about sites. I don't know if that was something which you were involved with, you know, to be out with the Glasgow area, if that makes sense. I heard some wonderful conversations with the volunteers about whether they could call themselves Clydesiders up in Budden, and I think they decided they were really Taysiders after all. Got any thoughts there?
Okay, no, I mean, great questions. In terms of the kind of permanent versus temporary structures at the Games, so there were a number of temporary structures. Squash, the show court for squash was also a temporary structure. Had a lot of kind of negative comment from Squash Scotland on that. It was actually after the Games, it was sold on to Toronto, so it's actually being used for the kind of World Cup event next year. And I guess the decision boiled down to what the future use was likely to be. So take the velodrome. Up until this point, we didn't have a covered velodrome in Scotland. We know that there's kind of demand for use, kind of siting it with the new National Indoor Sports Arena at the Emirates Arena, kind of, and part of that whole facility is a public access gym run by Glasgow Life, part of the Glasgow Club. We knew that we would kind of get kind of future use both in terms of participation, so anybody can turn up and use that velodrome. You need to go through an accreditation process, but it's quite easy, it's quite cheap. Clubs use it, and it's suitable for kind of future events. So we had a business plan in terms of future use, kind of ranging from kind of normal punters through to kind of World Cup events. Athletics, we looked at the different ways that we could have an athletics stadium, and we didn't build one, right? So we converted Hampden, and that was because in terms of the kind of predicted future use, both in terms of club use, I mean, there are actually quite a lot of, what you might call community athletic stadiums across Scotland. So we didn't really need a lot of track space for that. Would we get enough athletics kind of major events that would justify that size of athletics stadium? The calculation was no, and the rate of return on investment wasn't there. And I went to the Diamond League a few weeks before the Games, and actually the crowds, they were sizable, but they were kind of very far from full, and maybe that's partly, justifies that decision. So we converted Hampden. It was an athletics stadium on the cheap. It worked really well, and 2 tracks have since benefited from the track used at Hampden, and so we've got a legacy from the kind of dismantling of the track and taking it away. Shooting had its own particular challenges. Because of the regulation around handguns in Scotland, there were only a very few places that we could have held shooting and got the kind of necessary licenses, and using MOD property was a way of doing that. So that kind of dictated, dictated to an extent the location, and then back to kind of future use. Actually, we couldn't build the business case which would give that, or which would make that facility permanent. We are now looking at whether we can, as a legacy from the Games, kind of host a permanent training facility in Scotland. There are challenges there. I mean, not just the kind of, the legislative challenges in terms of handguns, but there are challenges in terms of the funding and finding, a kind of a partner and commercial partner who would support that. But it all hinges on the cost benefit and future use.
Sam Coleman, Head of Institute here, but I'm also on the board of directors of Scottish Volleyball. My question sort of deals with the legacy as well. In terms of the costs for things like hall hire in the UK generally, they're much higher than some European countries, so therefore some sports are priced out. Glasgow is actually one of the better councils in terms of free hire and things like that. Is there any way we can deal with that? Because you just mentioned cost benefits, but is there any way that the Scottish Government can deal with that in terms of trying to increase participation by reducing poor hire or pressurising councils to do this?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, your final comment there, pressurising. I guess our role in this space is exactly that. It's the influencing role. So in terms of facilities, there are very few, if any, facilities over which the Scottish Government has direct control. However, we do obviously work very closely with local authorities in terms of the kind of delivery of their sport and physical activity programme. We are also trying increasingly to have a direct relationship with leisure trusts. So up to now, our kind of relationship has primarily been with the actual council, not the leisure trust, and that has not necessarily, I think, given us the greatest degree of influence, given that the sector is now moving to one where leisure trusts are owning and controlling a lot of these facilities. What we can do on the sort of other side of the equation, if you like, is try and look to see where we can encourage, you know, multi-use facilities. So the Community Sports Hub initiative, which is part of the Legacy programme, that's to kind of deliver 150 community sport hubs by a date in the future, which escapes me at the moment. But that is kind of saying, well, what facilities do we have at the moment that we can use within a community as a base for clubs to come together and participate in sport and activity? They're generally schools. They're not all schools. There's some kind of community halls that are being, and that type of facility that are being used in that way. But we've had some great results with those. So there was an example that Stuart Harris, the Chief Executive of Sport Scotland, was telling me about in Dumfries and Galloway, where they designated a school a community sports hub. They'd opened it up and kind of publicised its local community, and a number of kind of sports clubs had decided to meet there, and they're tracking the participation data, and they'd found, you know, a kind of huge increase in the number of people coming to this place to participate in sport, and, you know, we'll be able to publish kind of fuller figures on that. So whilst that doesn't answer your question in terms of the charging, I suppose we're looking at more creative ways to try and open up some facilities, working with local authorities on the school estate. I mean, I would say quite an underused resource in a lot of cases. But pressure, you know, from governing bodies has to be part of the answer as well.
I think that, you know, the problem is maybe when children, you know, become adults and join adult clubs, the costs become prohibitive in some cases because they're used to, you know, having school and community sports clubs. But I think the problem is, you know, that then the adult clubs have to pay effectively going rates for all hires, which makes it prohibitively expensive in some cases.
Yeah.
I have a range of comments here. I'm conscious of several things. One is we've got potential audience in Canada, so I'm wondering if you could just say something about what we have learned or could learn from Canada or other countries in terms of Commonwealth Games or sport and physical activity. I know you led a delegation to Toronto before the Commonwealth Games, so there's that comparative angle. From a university perspective, one of the, you know, I just put my tuppence in there, one of the things I've always been very envious of the Canadian setup is something we don't necessarily have in Scotland, which is recognised dedicated research funding councils for dedicated streams of research on sport and physical activity and physical education, which you can apply for in Canada. My experience of that is, you know, in a UK setting, if you were going to research councils, you sometimes have to dress things up as something else. There's not a dedicated stream of funding for research in the areas that we do. So that's certainly very helpful in terms of Canadian. A different set of questions would be, you know, around about the policy networks in Scotland. Where is there an identifiable policy network where policy suddenly pops up? Who are the key groups, if you like? I'm trying to think of one example of a policy which would be of interest to people. So the debate about, say, 2 hours physical education in Scotland, the inception of that idea, the debate about how it should be costed or funded, and the monitoring through to seeing that it's happening. There's a policy trajectory. And the role of your office in that, or the role of a minister saying, where are we on this? Have we achieved this yet?
Yeah.
Go out there and sort that. Or other lobbying groups say, why are we spending money on here?
Yeah.
Why are we spending money on that? So I suppose the 2 hours physical education is an example of a policy. The question about what we can learn from other countries, and finally, where policy networks really are in Scotland, and maybe the relationship between St Andrew's House, Victoria Quay and Hollywood.
So in terms of Canada, I think we have learnt a great deal from the Canadian approach on physical activity. So they have a thing called the Toronto Charter, which is a kind of route map of, how to implement physical activity. And the Scottish Government, published a physical activity implementation plan earlier in the year. It's, again, part of the legacy. It's very short. I recommend that you read it. And it covers 7 themes, in terms of how do we promote and encourage physical activity, from kind of education to planning, so how our planning system can support physical activity. And we drew a lot of inspiration from the work that has been done in Canada on the Toronto Charter. And I think that's something that they've done kind of incredibly well, and they continue to kind of try and, I suppose, drive that throughout a range of institutions in Canada, and we're kind of looking to do the same. When I was in Canada, I had the kind of great fortune to visit the University of Toronto, I would say Scarborough. They said Scarborough. The University of Toronto Scarborough campus, where they're constructing new facilities. They're part of the kind of Pan Am Games, which will be held next year. And what I was struck by there, and what I thought was really good, and again, we could probably learn from this, was the integration of facilities, events, higher education, and participation. So these kind of absolutely brilliant facilities on a university campus, and a campus that was likely to kind of attract, kind of students with a kind of, performance sport bent, would also be open to the public. And they seem to just have kind of got that circle really well kind of squared in terms of how they were going to use the facilities in the future. In terms of, I'll take the sort of third one of those next, if that's okay. In terms of, where does policy come from? I mean, it's a really interesting question, and some of it can be, the minister says. And I remember a special advisor, he's no longer a special advisor, but he was one of the senior special advisors for the first SNP administration. And when the kind of SNP won in 2007, there was, a session kind of for special advisors led, by a senior official, might even have been the permanent secretary. And one of the things that was said was, if a minister says something, then it has to happen. And that was meant to be a kind of cautionary tale. It was, make sure your minister doesn't say anything too outrageous, because then we'll be in deep doodah, because we'll need to have to make it happen. The way the special advisor heard it was brilliant. If I want anything, or my minister wants anything to happen, all they need to do is say it publicly, and then the civil service will have to deliver. Which was really interesting. When he told me this story, I was thinking, flipping heck, that's really interesting in terms of how people kind of hear things differently. But, in answer to your question, some of it is, the that there will be 2 hours PE, and it can be based on kind of an evidence base, or it can't. But once, once a minister has decided something, and obviously our role is to provide the evidence base, the counter positions, the counter arguments, then that kind of that will happen. The other kind of, I suppose, slightly more rational way of formulating policy is kind of understanding where gaps are, and in terms of, say, market failure, and, this is, I guess, some of the economists coming out to me, what is the role of a kind of public administration in delivery of anything? And, in housing, I found this really interesting. What is the role of a government in a housing market, given that we have a whole range of providers? And so you're looking there at where government needs to step in and correct, perhaps for market failure. You then can take that kind of a step forward and kind of needs an expert in this, in looking at the outcomes that are delivered in terms of those interventions. And one of the things that we did in housing, and we are now doing with physical activity, is saying, where are we getting the biggest bang for our buck in terms of public policy? Because if we're doing this intervention in terms of public, so in terms of physical activity, so GP brief interventions is something that we've piloted. If that's not delivering anything, then let's not do it. So there's that analysis of, what the outcomes are, where we're getting the best return, and then understanding what we need to do to correct that if that's not right. And in terms of, where that dynamic lies between Victoria Quay, St Andrew's House, and Holyrood, I would say it's a reasonable equilibrium. And so, kind of, we, in terms of Commonwealth Games and Sport Directorate, we sit in Victoria Quay, which is very nice for me. It's got a swimming pool. And in St Andrew's House, kind of, that's where we're part of the Directorate General of Health and Social Care, so the rest of that Directorate General sit there. I think we are moving kind of much more to an integrated policy model in terms of health, where people understand that physical activity has a role in health. And similarly, in terms of the political base at Holyrood, and some of this comes from working with ministers for a long time, I think, they're receptive to arguments. And policy networks, I think that's a great question. I think that, and sort of conscious I'm kind of going on slightly too long here, but the National Strategic Group on Sport and Physical Activity, recently established, that needs to act, I think, as currently Ms Robertson's, who knows who the future Cabinet Secretary for Sport will be, but that needs to act as her key kind of advisory group from across the piece, not just her civil servants. Ministers don't want advice just from civil servants. They want to hear from kind of more voices than that. So that needs to act in that way. I think it's getting there. It's got some work to do. The Sport Scotland Board, I think that's got a really key role to play. They're the agency delivering sport in Scotland, so we need to be cognizant of their board's views. We need to listen to the academic community. I think that is underplayed at the moment. And I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting next to you. I'm here. And I think actually in quite a lot of my roles, I don't know that we've necessarily tapped into the academic community as much as we might have done.
Last question, Amanda.
I'm just going to jump in on that one. Quite a lot of the chat about legacy is related to physical activity, and understandably so that's important. Although there's not that many strong links between watching sport and then deciding to take up sport. We know that's kind of quite questionable. I wonder if there's potential for legacy around performance more generally. So what it takes to become very good at something, sustained effort, resilience, preparation, delivery when it matters, and if there's any sort of intentions to think about legacy around human performance and what a great example that is, and how broadly that could apply to our society.
I mean, I absolutely take your point, and in terms of the link between watching sport and then, you know, getting off your bum and doing something. And we published right at the end of April a report called the Pre-Games Report, which was effectively an assessment of legacy delivery up to that point, and was looking to see whether the elements of a successful legacy were in place at that point, and then obviously the future evaluation follows up on that. And in that we said, you know, studies have shown that the kind of link between major sporting events and kind of future increased participation is kind of tenuous. That's a paraphrase. However, the conditions that are needed to change that are about putting in place very early on a kind of legacy program which kind of can build on existing structures, delivery models for physical activity, and you know, says the report, not me, the signs are that those delivery structures and that kind of early sort of thought in terms of planning is there. And that's not to kind of take away your point, but I suppose what that report was saying was that it's probably as good as it can be at the moment. But we're only going to actually then, I think, reap the benefits of that if we can heighten the profile of, you know, the role of physical activity in terms of physical and health benefits, kind of ensure that, you know, as I said with the kind of, when I was answering the question about the Toronto Charter and physical activity implementation plan, make sure that it's in the consciousness of a lot more people than kind of people interested in sport like me, or some kind of health professional advisors in St Andrew's House. Are we looking at performance benefits and seeing if we can translate that, I suppose, to a sort of wider study? At the moment, no. I'm going to check with Neve if that's true. But, yeah.
Sorry, Tessa, I'm a PhD student new here, but actually I'm speaking as an elite athlete myself. My main sport is orienteering and hill running, so I wasn't in the Commonwealth Games, but I'm involved in a lot of Scotland-wide programmes that go and speak to school children. So the Winning Scotland Foundation has a Champions in Schools programme where we have 3 visits to the same school, and we talk about bouncing back, resilience, determination, all the qualities of being an elite athlete. And then there's been a particular initiative around the Commonwealth Games called Game On Scotland. So I did do some visits before, and I have been doing in the last few months post-Commonwealth Games, where it's pretty much a much freer topic of what we can choose, but we do all come across these like performance-based. It's for primary school kids, but yeah, so that was just...
Yeah, and that's a great link. And the other thing that Winning Scotland does is the Positive Coaching Scotland initiative, which, you know, again, is looking at not just kind of coaching from a very narrow perspective of improving an athlete's sporting success, but it's looking at coaching generally within kind of, you know, school settings, and it's about those kind of other factors such as kind of resilience, determination, how you respond to feedback, attitudinal issues. So absolutely, that's all happening. I suppose what I am not seeing, and you know, maybe this is a pitch, I don't know, is how we can draw some of the conclusions from the games and that kind of analysis of the games and kind of elite performance, and put it in that kind of wider performance context.